Everyone, and welcome to Chef AJ Live. I'm your host, Chef AJ, and this is where I introduce you to amazing people like you who are doing great things in the world that I think you should know about. As we continue with TrueNorth Health Center Week, we have another one of their fabulous doctors who does the phone coaching. His name is Dr. Frank Sabatino. He's not only an expert in water fasting and weight loss and addiction, but also hormones as well. Please welcome him to the show. It's so always great to see you. I'm lucky I get to see you every month and interview you for my private group, but I'm not sure everybody else knows you, and I want them to get to know who you are and how you came to be.
Well, thanks for the invite. And it's nice to be connected with the True North counseling program. You know, Dr. Goldhammer and I know each other, over 30 years. And we've wanted to work together at different times during all those days, all those years. And the truth is, I'm an East Coast kind of guy. So a lot of my work has always been East Coast. He's West Coast. I was really never really ready to completely relocate to California. So being able to be on the coaching service, this is a nice bonus. And I also just recently joined their institutional review board for the True North Foundation for the fasting and research part of their program. Because I have my background in science, I'm happy to bring that expertise to their review board because they're doing such amazing work in the fasting world and research. So all of it is great. It's just wonderful to do.
Well, there's not too many people in the world that have as much experience water fasting people as you and Dr. Goldhammer, are there?
I would say that's probably true. Probably between him and I, there's probably about 30,000 fasts that we've supervised through all these years. He's got a much bigger institution than I've been running in many more recent years. So the numbers of fasters he sees are far beyond what I see anymore. But if you calculate all the years, I mean, I've been doing this since the 1970s. So if you go back to those days on into the present, it's a lot of people. And then under a lot of serious health conditions too, which is amazing.
Yeah. How did you get into water fasting? But even more so, how did you even get exposed? You've been on a plant-based diet for a long time, and you're one of the few proponents that really are on the SOS-free version of it. So tell us how you got into that.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I was a child. I grew up in the 1950s, and the bottom line is I grew up as a child, had a long history of ulcerative colitis, a lot of colitis and bowel-related problems. And if you think we live in the dark ages now for the medical profession, imagine in the 1950s how little information there was relating nutrition to anything that would happen in the body. In fact, back then, if we have some readers that go back to the prehistoric times like I do, you'll remember that in many of the middle and grammar schools at the time, you had that big chart on the wall, which was the 4 basic food groups. And 2 of those were meat and dairy. And of course, no one ever thought to turn those charts around that were funded by the American Dairy Council back in the day. So I grew up in an Italian household. I had the best of food that my parents could provide. But of course, that was meat and dairy and cheese and all of these things. And I had all these bowel-related issues. And it's kind of interesting, from a very early stage of my life, I wanted to be a doctor. I knew that kind of early, even in my early teenage years. And it was kind of through all of that time, finally, when I got into college and I was in a pre-med program, I met a man who was the father of someone who was really like my sister, my closest friend for over 50 years, Uncle Luigi, nice Italian guy in the neighborhood in the Bronx. And he sold insurance in the Bronx. But he was unique in that he had collected an anti-medical library for about 20 years. And he was in constant correspondence with Dr. Herbert Shelton, who was one of the granddaddies of the fasting hygienic movement. And so when I would come over to her house to visit her, he knew that I was in a pre-med program and he would attack me at every turn. And I began as a teenager to read my way through his library of hygienic pioneers, alternative thinkers. And it was at that point that I first got exposed to eating and thinking about eating in more of a vegetarian way, and seeing these doctors that were now doing things differently, like fasting and lifestyle modification and all of that. And it was the first time when I started as a teenager applying some of these principles of eating more plant-based, that the colitis that had plagued me through my entire childhood now became a thing of the past. And I thought it was pretty funny that it took an insurance salesman from the Bronx, after 15 years of medical mismanagement, with some of the best experts in New York City on, intestinal and bowel related issues, who never at even once thought that diet had any relationship to what went on in the bowel, took this insurance salesman from the Bronx to solve the problem of colitis. So I thought it was kind of intriguing. And, as a teenager, I grew up, in the late 60s. That was a time of fermentation and revolution in places like New York City. So I was fasting and trying vegetarian living and eating, and then doing every other major pharmaceutical and drug on the streets of New York at the same time. It was a time of upheaval. And that was a time when I first decided to do a little bit of fasting, a little bit of this, and I started to realize that medicine was not going to be the best direction for me. I didn't really want to do medication. I didn't really want to do surgery. I wanted to treat and teach people more naturally. And I also, knew some chiropractors back in that time who were very passionate. They were very fired up about health. I got exposed to them. I got to know some of them. And that's what triggered me to then decide to go in the direction of going to chiropractic college rather than medical school, because I knew then that I could do nutrition. I could do, kind of alternative things to help people and still be licensed, still be a physician, but not do drugs and surgery. So to make the story short, I ended up going into chiropractic college, and I started a natural hygiene club in chiropractic college. And I got to meet all of the doctors at that time who were doing fasting work. So I met Dr. Scott, Dr. Burton, Dr. Sidwa, all of these iconic people that were in the natural hygiene movement at the time, which now has become known as the National Health Association, the NHA, but it used to be the American Natural Hygiene Society. And so I started to visit with some of them. And when I finished my chiropractic training, I decided that I was going to do an apprenticeship for fasting. And I went and I spent over a year with Dr. David Scott in Strongsville, Ohio, and I ran his blood lab. He had his own laboratory for doing blood work on fasting people. So it was the first time that I got a chance to really see the impact of fasting on blood chemistry. And I helped to, run his blood lab that he did every week on all his fasters. So from that point, I then got, involved with running my own institution back in the late 70s. It was the Shangri-La Natural Hygiene Institute, one of the iconic places that was established back then. And we had 110, 120 people a week with as many as 40 and 50 fasters a week on water only. And so I got a chance to really see what fasting can do, what the plant-based lifestyle could do. And then when I finished that, I opened my own place for a short while, but I decided I wanted to do more research. And so I went back to medical school, the Emory University School of Medicine, and did brain and endocrine research, hormonal research for the next 5 years, and then became an assistant professor at the University of Texas after that, where we did the pioneer work on calorie restriction and aging. And that's where the whole model of intermittent fasting and calorie restriction came out of a lot of that work in the late 1980s and 90s. And then I wound up being the health director of the Regency Health Spa in Hallandale, Florida, starting in 1989. And I spent the next 25 years running that place and doing my own retreats. So it was through that time, that whole journey, that, starting the last animal products were back probably in the early 1970s. But it really wasn't until probably the 90s and early 2000s that I really committed to more of the SOS. And I will admit that, I had those discussions with Dr. Goldhammer where he was already really incorporating that in his own center. And, and through our conversations and through our interaction, I realized that that was really the next step of going in a really good direction to help people break addictions and improve their quality of life and health. So then that became the next natural step in my own vegan and plant-based lifestyle to go with more of the SOS. And then I incorporated that in my own centers and in my own counseling. So that's kind of a small snapshot going back from the 1960s right up into the present day.
So the vegan came before the SOS.
The what?
The vegan part of the diet came before the
Oh
SOS.
yeah, I was vegan going back into the 1970s. So that was ongoing, but I was still using some oil. We were still using some salt, we were still whatever. So those things hadn't been completely eliminated. They weren't used a lot because I'm not someone who likes stuff that's oily, or that's not anything that was ever really that appealing to me, even though I grew up in an Italian household and was surrounded by quite a bit of oil. But really, the real commitment came much later after being vegan over a much longer period of time.
Right. Was Herbert Shelton himself vegan and SOS free?
I would say not, but you know what? He advocated a diet that was pretty much mostly raw back in the day. And he's, of course, the one who wrote the original text on food combining, which we don't really use anymore. We don't really, address that as hard science anymore. So his dietary plan was pretty close to that, I'd say, because he didn't really talk about eliminating those things, but he certainly didn't really include them as a part of his overall nutritional recommendations. And of course, Shelton back then, he ran probably the most well-known and largest of the fasting institutions of the time. I'd say now, of course, the largest one would definitely be TrueNorth without any question. So, but back then he pioneered that. And I even went out there before I decided to go to chiropractic college, when I was a teenager with Uncle Luigi, my mentor in the Bronx. We wrote a paper called Social Commentary, A Challenge to Think. And we were writing health articles when I was a teenager. And he used to be in correspondence with Shelton. And at one point, Shelton published a couple of the things I wrote in his hygienic review. And that was such a big thing for me, being a teenager, having this big granddaddy of the hygiene movement acknowledge, some of the things I was writing. So that was kind of cool.
You know what, Dr. Sabatino, what I think separates pretty much all the staff at TrueNorth and all the doctors from other wonderful plant-based doctors is the SOS-free component. Many of the plant-based doctors get the O, like some of them actually are fine with oil, but a lot of them, especially the cardiologists, they understand the oil, but they feel that telling people but not to have flour or sugar or salt or alcohol is going to make it too hard to be vegan, or it's too extreme. But when I'm learning from the TrueNorth doctors, it's sometimes that's what it takes, especially if people already have an illness. 20-year-old athlete, maybe it's not so important, but the kind of people you see, that actually is necessary in the healing. Vegan is not enough. Am I correct?
Yeah, I would say that that's true, because we now know, for example, with things like salt, it can actually promote inflammatory change. It can promote even there's some data now on salt related to autoimmune disease, actually promoting that, things like rheumatoid and so on. We know that it can damage the calyx in the wall of blood vessels, causing changes and damage related to heart disease. We know it can raise blood pressure. So look, there are factors around the SOS components that are really, really very important. And I think once people realize that it's not about deprivation. So, if we're teaching people how to prepare food and we're taking away salt, we're certainly not taking away herbs and spices. We're certainly not taking away maybe the use of some vinegars, flavored vinegars. So once they realize that they're not losing taste, it's not about deprivation, it's just about making adjustments and some substitutions, I think people can be more right with it. And I know that is a fear that, look, you're going to turn people off by trying to take too many things away too quickly. But I'm always of the mind of, I know fully well that nobody likes deprivation. In all the years of counseling people, I've yet to find anybody who loves deprivation. In fact, when I tell people not to do something, there's a part of their brain that wants to do it and wants to do it in your face. So you've got to give them substitutions. And now we know that with all of these remarkable herbs, spices, and other things that you can use, there's no lack, there's no deprivation, and they can make the transition more successfully.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've worked, what I find fascinating about your book, and that's actually, not your book, hopefully you'll have a book soon, but your work. And that's how we actually met, because I was reading an article you wrote for the NHA magazine, is you really seem, and Dr. Goldhammer as well, understand this addiction piece with people, because people don't look at food as an addiction. And, they say you can't be addicted to food or eating, but I think you guys really understand that for a lot of people it is.
Well, most people misunderstand addiction and compulsive disorders. because it's one thing to eat. It's another thing to use food to self-medicate dissonance on an emotional and even spiritual level. And that's when addiction becomes a real issue, because it moves into us using some of the basic things that are associated with pleasure. What Dr. Goldhammer and Doug Lyle have called their pleasure trap is really about the brain reward cascade. We have the ability to experience pleasure. And not only that, we've associated pleasure with things that promote our survival. For example, eating and sexual function. Those are major pieces. So not only are we driven to do those things, but we have pathways in the brain that remember it, that motivate us to do it. So all of that is tied into the choices we make and how we behave. So the fact is, we need food for survival. We need food, and we should be able to enjoy it. The problem is that if we have emotional issues, or we have trauma or things that have occurred in our lives that have interrupted our ability to experience pleasure, we now want to self-medicate our pain. We want to self-medicate our discomfort with things that are very readily available. And those are the 5 major forms of addiction. And that's drugs and alcohol, sex, food, risk-taking, and then process addiction like shopping and other things. So, you've got to segregate using food, compulsively using food, and then being addicted to food as a form of self-medication. Those are all different things. And the bottom line is, and I'm not going to go heavy into addiction today, but the bottom line is for addiction is that it's got to be the compulsive use of something. And here's the important piece: without regard for negative consequences. So if I'm eating and I'm looking in a mirror and my blood sugar is going up and I'm creating heart disease and obesity and diabetes, and I continue to eat, that would be considered food addiction because there's a negative consequence. If I abuse some substance, like let's say refined sugar, and there's not an overwhelming negative consequence, it could be considered food abuse, but not necessarily addiction. So there's a pattern from use to abuse to addiction and compulsive use. And it all centers around how we use food to self-medicate ourselves. And that's a big difference. And again, as you made the point, it's convenient, it's easy, and it's also socially acceptable. It's probably the only addiction you can do in public and nobody cares. You know what I mean? So that's that in drinking in a way, because you can go to bars and drink. You can't drive, but food addiction, you can drive, you can do everything, and you can kind of get by even in the public eye with that addiction.
Right, because everybody else is doing it at the same time. That's right.
And especially when you know now that close to 70% of this country is either overweight or obese, you realize that it's a massive problem.
Yeah, I love that you say that's the only addiction you can do in public, and not well, there are consequences, but just not the same social consequences of.
That's right.
And yeah, that's incredible. Do you find that you have over 40 years experience doing this? Do you find that it's getting worse?
What part? What do you ask?
Just not only just the obesity, but the people. It seems like there's even more addictions now than back in the day. I mean, we didn't used to have cell phones and social media. It seems like almost like there's more things for people to get addicted to now.
Well, that's true. There's definitely more mind and mood altering things, even whether you get into video games, whether you get into, all of the glut of things around us. And that, of course, also includes the glut of designer drugs, the glut of foods and processed products. If you think about it, we've created an excess of everything that feeds all of those different addictions. And so the bottom line is, yeah, it's a problem. And unfortunately, even with drugs and alcohol, even the medical profession itself, just because someone in a white coat gives you something doesn't make it less addictive. I mean, if you look at things like benzodiazepine drugs, which are some of the most addictive drugs on the planet, they're given by prescription to many people from physicians, doesn't mean they're not creating a problem. Think about all the opiates that were prescribed that created opiate addicts under the guise of treating pain. So, there's so much more of everything that feeds this process of addiction in the culture. And that's what makes it very difficult and very profound.
Wow. What kind of things do you like to work on with people, or do they seek you out for through the phone coaching services of TrueNorth?
Yeah, in the phone coaching, my target area that I've kind of worked out is related to weight related issues, people that have issues of, trying to regulate weight more successfully and understanding all the pieces that go into that. Because I think people need to know that it's not just a food issue, though that's a major issue, because activity, stress, sleep, all of these things can have impact on that weight story. Again, issues of addiction, again, dealing with some of those. We also deal with some of the questions of hormonal balance. People that have fatigue and issues of thyroid or, reproductive hormone issues that I can maybe provide some insight because of my background in neuroendocrinology, which I spent a lot of time with through the years. So, yeah, I would say from the standpoint of endocrine function, weight-related issues, addiction issues, those are some of the major focuses on the coaching service that I provide.
Right. You talk about thyroid. I've been doing this live show for over a year and a half now. And anytime we have a doctor on, that always seems to be one of the top questions. If somebody can either prevent going on medication or go off their medicine for hypothyroidism, specifically Hashimoto's, and if water fasting can help with that.
Well, the better question is, why has it become epidemic? I mean, if you think about it, years ago, we didn't see this panorama of thyroid conditions. And, we know the thyroid is a major organ that's involved with metabolism. It's involved with energy dynamics. It's even involved in some of the responses to chronic fight or flight stress. So the thyroid plays a major role in energy metabolism, weight regulation, all these temperature control in the body. So, it occupies a unique niche in the endocrine system. It's an important organ. But because of that, it has become affected by many of the disturbances of modern life, especially things like stimulant abuses, inflammatory diets, high protein diets that are affecting, high animal protein diets that actually create autoimmune responses, high gluten intake in the body. So a number of things that have become part of our dietary plan, part of our lifestyle, can uniquely target the thyroid, for example. So, for example, you have an enzyme in the thyroid that it mimics the gliadin that's a part of gluten. And so if the body's creating a reaction from a lot of gluten consumption, and you've got damage to the gut itself, the gut flora, and these proteins are seeping into the bloodstream, and your body starts creating an immune response against them, if it finds similar proteins in your organs or your joints, it's going to attack those. So with the gliadin and gluten, when it creates a kind of an antibody response against that, it can start to create an antibody response against the hormone in the thyroid. If you're eating a lot of high animal protein, you're programming that immune system to create a lot of antibody production against the antigens of those proteins. And that can also start to damage those organs. I know Neil Barnard in his recent book talked a lot about that programming. And we know in some of the long-term studies like the Epic Oxford and so on, that people that are eating plant-based that eliminate the high intake of those inflammatory animal proteins show remarkable improvements of the thyroid. They show much lower thyroid problems. They show much lower incidence of those problems. So the way we eat in modern times, the way we use so many stimulant abuses, coffee, energy drinks, we're creating this remarkable stimulation that whatever goes up has to come down. So then there's a reactive crash. There's kind of a reactive physiological depression. So the adrenal, the thyroid gland, these glands become affected by the pressures of modern life, and just the chronic stress itself causes more exhaustion in the cycle of the fight or flight response. And then we also see a kind of a decreased function of these endocrine glands like thyroid, adrenal. And so, yeah, it's problematic, and it's a byproduct of modern life in many ways, where we have so many things demanding our attention that we're burning the candle out at 6, 8, and 10 ends, cutting it in 3 or 4 places. and burning it out at all these ends. And we pay a price for that. And part of that price is a decreased function of these endocrine organs like adrenal, thyroid, and the like.
Right. And one of the things about, I think, all the TrueNorth health doctors is none of them are really a fan of caffeine.
I totally am opposed to it. In fact, I've seen issues with caffeine withdrawal that were worse than cocaine. And I mean in serious cocaine addicts. So, it's an accepted, material in our culture, but people cannot get past the idea that caffeine is a mood altering substance that causes artificial stimulation. Now, if you have a cup of coffee in a day, I think most people are not going to argue with that. But the truth of the matter is, these stimulants like caffeine in coffee or caffeine in energy drinks or caffeine in anything are going to mask your underlying fatigue and depression. So you're not really paying attention to that in your life because you're stimulating it instead of addressing the causes of it, that now you can start to regenerate your own energy again. So to me, it's not only the drug itself being a problem, but that it gives you the illusion that there's nothing wrong. And so that you're not paying attention now to what you can actually do to fix your own energy impairment. And that's important.
Yeah. And the TrueNorth health doctors are also not a fan of another popular drug that people that often consume caffeine consume later in the day, alcohol.
Yeah, that's again, look, that to me, alcohol is probably the most dangerous drug on the planet. It creates some of the most devastation. It's one of the, maybe the only, but certainly one of the only drugs that you can die in withdrawal from. Even opiates and other things you can. So, alcohol to me has no redeeming value, has no redeeming quality. And so I don't condone it, even a glass a day or whatever. If you drink it, look, I'm not the police. I'm certainly not the alcohol police, but I would tell people that if you're going to use it very sparingly and realize that even a single glass is drug abuse. It may not be drug addiction, but it certainly is drug abuse.
See, the thing is that I agree with you, by the way, but this is not a popular stance.
No, I know. Especially when recently, if you recall, there was a time when they were trying to tell people that having a glass or two of wine was going to actually have health benefit. Now, more recent studies came out to show that that's not true. And of course, this is the most condoned drug on the planet, though marijuana is probably catching up, which is probably better because I think it's a far better substitute than alcohol. Not that I condone the use of any of it, but the bottom line is it isn't a popular stance because it's a major industry besides, and there are people that's what they use to relax. That's what they use to come down. That's what they use to handle the stresses of the day. And look, there are alternative ways to address, ways to come down and find peace and balance in your life. I think using substances that are notoriously devastating, like alcohol, are problematic.
Do you think most people that you've seen in your fasting centers, and that I can ask Dr. Goldhammer this, of course, he'll be on later this week, are they coming in following kind of a health promoting diet like you and I eat, or are they coming in with a lot of these addictions?
The people I see far less fasting people now than Dr. Goldhammer does. I think through all the years, I had many people who were not living this lifestyle at all, who wanted to try to do fasting. But I will tell you that many times when we do the screening for fasters, before they actually come into fast, the recommendation is that they get into doing the lifestyle for some short period of time before they even come in, because the withdrawal and the pain of withdrawal from some of these substances and eating habits quite painful and quite annoying. So we try to get people to at least commit to some of that before they come. And I think now there's more people who are aware that plant-based eating has some value. They may not do it 100%, they may do it some percent, but I would say probably more people that come into fast are probably eating a little bit healthier now than they did in the past, for sure.
Yeah, that's great. Are there, I know this is a funny question, but I've actually had doctors answer it. Are there certain diseases that you actually like working more with, especially on the phone coaching? I know that like there's a doctor that does it and she has autoimmune disease. She goes, oh, I love patients with autoimmune disease.
No, I like to help people with anything that I think I can help them with, meaning that a lot of times they don't know that, for example, what they're doing could actually not only prevent what they're experiencing, but even reverse it. So if I have somebody that's a diabetic, or I have somebody with autoimmune, or I have somebody with those kinds of conditions, and I know how powerful the lifestyle and the eating plan is to help that, I get really excited about that because no one's told them that. And all of a sudden they're going to have a revelation. And if they make small adjustments, they're going to see such profound results. And you just know that that's coming. And that's really an exciting thing. So I don't have one thing, though I do, because of my training and my experience, I do like helping people with addiction because a lot of times they're hopeless and lost in their own minds. And I think giving them hope. And again, this whole lifestyle is really about the biology of hope. Because, you know, we're told conventionally that if you have certain diseases, you're stuck with that for life. You know, you can't do anything about it. And then we know how many things can not only be prevented, but be reversed. So I like giving people hope and laying out a path and a program where they know that, yeah, if I do this, wow, I've got a shot at this incredible improvement in quality of life, or I got this shot at really taking this weight down that's really harming me or hurting me. So all of that is exciting for me.
You know, there's so many different points of view when it comes to addiction. Like some people say it's a disease, some people say it's not. But I'm wondering, how do you feel about abstinence? Because I've had some doctors on the show that say, well, you know, it's not everybody has to do that. But I like abstinence because it's very easy to understand, you know.
That's a great question. The bottom line is I fundamentally come from the place that it is a dis-ease state. Now, I define dis-ease differently than a lot of doctors do, but it certainly is a lack of ease. It's a lack of a state of well-being, easily enough. And we say it's a disease pattern because there are disturbances that can occur at a level where things have gotten out of balance. The normal homeostasis of neurotransmitter control and release is off, so that the brain reward pattern is off. There's more reward deficiency. So there are things that are a lack of ease. So I ascribe to the disease model because if you don't, then you're in the position where you're feeling like, well, it's only a problem of willpower and change. Because addiction is not a willpower problem. You can have the greatest willpower in the world. You can be the most intelligent person in the world. But there's a point where that part of your brain that is driving that addictive process is hijacking the rational part of the brain. And there's work that has to be done to link those back up where you can, again, be in a position of taking control. That's why in the disease model, they pretty much teach abstinence. Now, you have approaches in the whole field of addiction now where there's medically assisted treatment, where they're giving people drugs like Suboxone or methadone to get people off of drugs like heroin. So they're not practicing abstinence. But the bottom line is, I think the feeling is that there's one part of the addiction model that is seen genetically, where they feel there's a genetic modification of the receptors for dopamine in the brain. And that those people are much more true addicts. And when they use, they become the pickles of addiction. And so once those people are pickled, there's never going to be a cucumber again. So they can't use, they have to be completely abstinent. There's other people who will come off of drugs like opiates and then be comfortably smoking a little pot or doing a little CBD. So they never go into complete abstinence. And so I kind of walk the fence of trying to figure out what's going to work best for that person. Because to me, if they're coming from a place where they're a hardcore alcoholic and they're going to kill themselves with alcohol, and they're taking a little bit of a, let's say, an indica strain of marijuana to get some sleep at night for anxiety or whatever, I'm not going to be so hardcore that I'm going to beat somebody up for that. So, but I do feel that the more that you can take the road of abstinence, the more clear you can be in the process of recovery.
Right. Well, because I can't help it. I have Dr. Goldhammer's voice in my head who always says, if you could have controlled it, you would have controlled it and you wouldn't have. So I'm wondering how somebody, and especially with food, because I work with a lot of people that have food addictions and especially want to release weight. And my feeling is if you couldn't eat these foods to get the body you want, how are you going to, do you understand what I'm saying? Like it just seems.
No, that's all, it's all real and it's all understandable. And that's what I'm saying. So you have to evaluate, how you handle those triggers in your life. And if you realize that you can't, then you don't do them. I mean, if you're a hardcore alcoholic and you've got a genetic predisposition to alcoholism, you cannot use alcohol. You couldn't use it before and you won't be able to use it in the future. So you've got to understand that and you've got to see where you are. Now, if you're a food addict and let's say sugar was a big trigger and you got to this point of enlightenment where you could have a little bit of refined sugar and walk on, can I argue with that? Not necessarily, but I don't know how well you'll be able to do that. I really don't, because with the triggers that exist. So the person has to really find their place. And I think sometimes the abstinent path is actually an easier path than trying to control something that was really driving you out of control for, let's say, a very substantial part of your life.
I think it's way easier because then you're not constantly being teased with everything, the temptation. But I get it that most people don't seem to be able to do it or don't want to do it. And do you think part of the problem with abstinence is the social environment?
Understand there's always set and setting, always. And there's always linkage, meaning that human beings link so many parts of their behavior. It's environment, it's location. For example, there can be certain sounds, there can be certain smells, there can be certain environments that you have associated with your old patterns of addiction and use. And just the sound of something or the smell of something could actually bring that back up in the brain. So yeah, that's what makes dealing with addiction so complicated. What Thomas Szasz, who was an very famous psychiatrist, wrote a book called Ceremonial Chemistry, The Ritual of Drug Taking. And it was all about those environmental cues, those settings that can take us to that place of craving and use. And it's very real. And it can even be your social network. It can be an environment that was common for where you would use before or where you would get food that you got, those kinds of things. So setting and environment is very important.
Yeah. Well, it seems like people like Dr. Goldhammer and I believe even Dr. Joel Furman, who never had a drink of alcohol or a cup of coffee, it's very easy because it's like, especially if you are prone to addiction, don't take that first bite, sip, or snort or puff.
Well, yeah, but I get it. And that's nice that they were able to do that. I know very few people that have been able to do that. I certainly didn't do that. I went through long periods of drug use, drug abuse, and all kinds of stuff. I mean, cravings and compulsive use of all kinds of stuff. And so the bottom line is, having gone through that and having looked at that, I feel has given me an insight about that you really can't have unless you have been through that. Because otherwise you're from a position where you say, well, look, I never did this. I never had the need to do this. I never found the need to do it. So why do you feel you have the need to do it? You know what I mean? So the bottom line is that's not how the world works, though, because most of the people we meet have had to deal with some degree of use and abuse. And so you've got to counsel them through that process. I think I think what it does with me, it probably gives me more patience than someone like Dr. Goldhammer. Right. You understand what I'm saying? Right. And I love Alan and we're good friends, but I think when you come from that position, you can become very impatient with people that seem to not just go where you want them to go as quickly as you want them to go there.
Right. Well, that's why he doesn't do the phone coaching, because he'll just say, suck it up, Buttercup. Exactly. Well, I think that makes you much more relatable for one. And also you're very kind. And I've seen you as a doctor in Florida. And so I think that really makes it very easy.
Well, it's because there, but for the grace of God goes I. I mean, I've been on that path. I know the dance. So, once you've danced and you know the dance, you have a little more tolerance for the dancers. You know what I'm saying? Bottom line.
Right. Exactly. One thing though, that Dr. Goldhammer says that I really do agree with, tell me what you think. He says, health results from healthy living.
Well, there's no argument at all. That's 100% true.
So,
And I think that's always been the foundation of natural hygiene, going back past Shelton, back into the 19th century, that there's no commodity, there's no mystery to this, that when we make choices, there are consequences. If the consequences of what you're choosing are healthy outcomes, then you got healthy option and healthy outcome. If what you're choosing to do does not have a healthy consequence, how can you create a healthy outcome? You can't. So healthy living is built by healthy choices and healthy process. So I agree 100%.
so yeah, how do you define healthy living?
I define healthy living by incorporating those things that are the basic biological requirements to all living things. And that means healthy food. And from this standpoint, food that we know feeds the body on every level. And that to me is all plant-based food. It involves some degree of physical movement because we're animals that are designed to move and we need it. We need fresh air. We need to take time each day where we allow ourselves to get out in the natural environment and breathe and just really take time for that. It involves sleep and rest. So understanding the important role of that. And for human beings, it involves this whole idea of a balance in our relationships with people outside of ourselves. And so the stress component of our lives, how we integrate ourselves into those demands, those things that demand our attention on a daily basis. How do we find balance in how we treat those things, deal with those things? So healthy living to me is finding some degree of peace and balance within how you are applying and appropriating the basic biological necessities of life. And understanding that the things that don't support health are not things that you would ever take in at any time, even if you deviate from health. And this is a very important hygienic concept, because the idea is these things that we're calling the biological requirements, food, rest, sunshine, air, all of that, they promote life for all living things, including us. Let's suppose we have a state of disease where we have deviated from a state of health, a state of well-being. In the modern medical world, the idea now is we're going to put things into your body that normally in a state of well-being would create disease. If I give you a drug when you're healthy, it's going to create some discomfort or disease. So the medical model is we're going to take somebody who's deviated from health and we're going to start putting things inside of them that would create disease in a healthy person. Our model is very simple. When you are sick, you don't need new things. You don't need poisonous medications. You need the same biological requirements, only more rigorously applied. So if you needed sleep and rest before, and now you're sick, you need more rest. If you needed water and good food before, now you're sick, now you need to even be more rigorous in how you take those things in. So there's a consistency to understand that we need certain biological requirements and social environments, and that will promote life and health. And if we deviate from health, we need to really bring those things in even more emphatically into our life. And so once you see that continuum, that connection, it opens up a very simple way of looking at life, health, and the world.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, what's interesting is we've had 7 of the doctors, and we will have 7 depending, you know, some have gone before you, some will after, for the TrueNorth Health Center that do phone coaching, with the exception of Dr. Goldhammer, who doesn't do the phone coaching. And almost all of them, except for you and Dr. Lyle, you know, live in Santa Rosa and work there. And so they get to eat like all their meals there, you know, 3 meals a day. You don't. So how does that work for you? Do you cook for yourself? Do you have less temptation, more temptation having to do it yourself?
You know what? You know this too. What happens is the longer you do something, the more you open up what we call facilitated pathways, where those are the choices you tend to make because they're the ones that are in line with your thinking, in line with your belief, behavior, and experience. So this is not even a question for me, meaning that I do a lot of my own food prep. I live with my 2 sons. They will cook certain things on certain days. So, you know, we cook for each other and we do that. And even if I eat out, which I don't do a lot of anymore, but there are certain restaurants where I know I can get what I want. So it's become such second nature over all these 45 plus years. That's not temptation. The things that turn me on the most in food are the things I'm eating in this plan. Meaning I'm happy with having, rice, beans and a big salad with a lovely dressing. I'm happy with, so to me, it's gotten pretty simple over time in that I'm not tempted by that as much in terms of things out in the world because they're not as attractive to me anymore. Now, they were at one point, but the same way, and people need to know this, that the taste that you have now may not be the taste that you have once you make this commitment to this lifestyle, because your taste will change. And things that, in the past you may have found not as tasty or whatever, now all of a sudden they have an explosive attractiveness to you in taste. Like a simple salad, is like mind bending. It's beautiful. You say that to most people in our culture, they think you're out of your mind because they're so used to eating stuff so seasoned and sparked and spiked and condimented. And so their taste mechanism has been so distorted. So once you've done this long enough, you're loving simple quinoa with some veggies and a big salad. And it's like, oh my God, that was great. Or a baked sweet potato. What's better than a Hannah sweet potato with maybe, for me, with maybe just a little dash of avocado blended, mixed in. I mean, it's like heavenly, you know what I mean? And so you tell people that and they kind of look at you like, you got to be out of your mind. That's why people love to eat with me, because even if I'm out and I can eat anywhere what I want, and I'll get the simplest things and they'll see my excitement and it gets them really activated because they're like, oh my God, you're so excited about eating these very simple things. And I said, yeah, they're amazing. In season, I'll pick a mango off a tree. Is there anything better than a ripe mango at the peak of season? I mean, it's like, it's one of those great experiences of life. So, I think once we can get turned on again by the things that are most natural and things that need to be appropriated into our bodies and our life, when you have that kind of excitement, that's what we're trying to evolve to, because then we get away from having to be dependent on all this junk that's sold in the culture and is trying to addict people in a financial way, in a health way, to methods and modes of living that only feed corporations and industries that could care less about our individual health. And so we are about that, and the lifestyle we're recommending is all about that.
Yeah. So what you're kind of talking about is that concept of taste neuroadaptation.
Yeah, we're adapting to something that really should not be something we should have had to adapt to. It should have been given to us from the moment we were born, and that's the way it should have been from the get-go. But we had to go through all of this dance, being exposed to whatever we were exposed to in this culture, with the exception of maybe people like Mark Huberman or Alan or Joel Furman. But for the most of us, look, we had all the processed junk. We had this, we had that, and we had to circle through that to come back to this idea of just really allowing our bodies to appropriate and adapt to what is in our best interest. And that's what this is about. What's in your best interest? And can you have fun and enjoyment from what's in your best interest? And the answer to that is absolutely. You can have the greatest pleasure from the things that are in your best interest. And it's not about deprivation and loss. It's about getting exciting and turned on to highest level health and quality of life.
Yeah. Well, that's fantastic. And water fasting can help with this, facilitate this taste neuron.
Water fasting helps remarkably because it's one of those ways where you're stepping back from your normal course of living and all of the tensions and stresses, and you're allowing yourself to go inside, to become more introspective. I'm a big student of martial arts in the form of Neigong, Qigong, and these kinds of things, where it's a lot about internal awareness. Fasting is a great tool for internal awareness. If you think about it, we're always constantly being pulled outside with all the glut of information and all the commercialism around us. So that for most of us, we're just, anxious creatures, just kind of vibrating with all of this massive input from the outside. And we spend very little time slowing down and going inside, stepping back from that. And that's why I like these practices like yoga and Qigong and so on, because they allow you to take a step back. Fasting is like that. It allows you to become more introspective and open to what's really real for your body, for your mind, for your health. And if you use fasting in the right way, with that introspective mode, that introspective dance, you'd be surprised what you can start to put in perspective. I've treated a number of major addicts, including opiate addicts, with water-only fasting. And it's a great tool for that process of getting past the self-centeredness of addiction, being open, understanding more about the body, its function, and what you can do to help yourself. It opens things up. And fasting also improves your sense of taste. So you get more sensitivity to taste, so that when you're eating again, things like a plain piece of romaine lettuce are like exploding in your mouth. So there's more sensitivity, more introspection. I love fasting for those purposes.
But people shouldn't do it at home, right? And that's not what the phone coaching is about.
Well, the phone coaching is making people understand that, look, things come up in fast, and we take fasting very seriously in terms of physiological changes that can occur. That's why we recommend doing it monitored in an institution or a retreat center where you have good people with the experience of monitoring fasts. And we've got a number of those across the country. You got TrueNorth, you got Dr. Gershfeld's place in California, you got Gracie in Ohio, you got different people. I do fasting retreats in Florida. So we have people that do and have been trained in monitoring fast. If you've done it and you wanted to do a couple of days, 3 days or so at home, and you're okay with that, to me, you still have to understand that it has to be done under resting conditions. You have to hydrate well. To me, it makes more sense to just do it under professional supervision the right way.
Great. Nice. So I'm going to have the link in the show notes to anything you want, but also to how do people get the appointment with you. But do you have any last words or thoughts or wisdom you want to impart?
Just know that as you're going through the dance and you're going through the changes in your own life, if you do need support, and you do need someone to talk to, and you do need someone to help you outline those lifestyle factors that are going to really give you the greatest opportunity to be well, you may not be getting that from your typical normal physicians. And of course, we're not advocating that you leave them, but we're advocating that you now know that we have a service that can provide you with that support and information. And I'm reachable at Dr. Sabatino at TrueNorthHealth.com. That's all there is to that. You go on that site and you make the appointment, and you can see me or any of the docs at that particular site. But just know that we're there for your support. We're there to give you whatever help that we can.
Well, thank you. I'm very excited that you're doing this. Thank you so much, Dr. Sabatino.
Thank you very much. Thank you, guys. Thanks.
And thanks all of you for watching another episode of Chef AJ Live. Please come back tomorrow when we have another wonderful doctor, a staff doctor of the TrueNorth Health Center named Dr. Chilla Varesh, and she is going to be talking about the power and importance of sleep. Take care.